Hello, everyone. Is anyone here yet? We are only on page, I think, 38 of the book. Let's see. 4 people waiting. How is everyone doing today? I decided I would do my makeup to try to feel better. So I hope everyone's doing good today. We are going to start reading again, Evil Men. I'll wait a second for everybody to get here. Hi, good morning, Jessica. We're just reading this book on evil men, people that did some of the worst war atrocities from the Imperial Army, Japanese Imperial Army during World War II and the Second Sino-Japanese War. I think some of the first, no, just Second Sino-Japanese War. So, hi, Patrick. Thank you, Jessica. Hi, October, whatever. I'm glad everyone's doing well. So, I will start reading. Okay. So, the scale of atrocity. I guess it would help if I had my microphone in front of me so you guys could hear me. That might be a good idea. To the scale of atrocity is unselfing. The scale of atrocity is unselfing, and self-examination as a response is a natural protective reflex, a way of restoring one's own emotional reactions to their familiar central place. It is also narcissistic, and it's a luxury morality. But avoidance, refusing to interrogate one's own relationship to the desire to see, to make something seeable, is no better, perhaps worse. Why do you do this kind of work? What personal dramas are you playing out, and what blind spots might you leave with? Atrocity work requires an appropriate drawing of the gaze towards the self that is inappropriate. So the I remains here in this book, as do the apologies, even if now they are disguised as analysis. As I look back on it, I realize there is one thing I forgot to apologize for in the talk in South Korea. It also has to do with Schlink's moral collision of public and private. The collision is especially intimate to the writer, or rather, is the result of intimacy of writing. This is my 4th problem, and like the others, it has the structure of paradox. Writing of this kind is simultaneously personal and impersonal, connected and alienated. When you interview somebody for their story, you are not extracting data. You are entering into a relationship. Sometimes when they invite you into their homes and into their most vulnerable memories, there comes a moment when you see each other. It is as delicate and trusting moment as humans can share. When you part after this happens, you believe you must meet one other again. You say so to each other. You plan, but in most cases, you never do. And then time passes and the moment is forgotten, and then the people aren't really people anymore. They are material. That's when you can write about them, when you're mentally, emotionally far away. The best writers can achieve that state quickly. It takes me a while, and it was especially hard this time. These men were great material. They were also individuals, tragically real individuals, who had urgent internal visions of the story I would tell about them. What would they think about what I finally wrote? Some might have been disappointed by a version of their story that did not put at center stage the moral clarity provided by their communist re-education and Chinese prison camps. Some might have been disappointed by a book that treated them as instances of psychological patterns, rather than fully exploring their individual paths towards reconciliation and forgiveness. Some might have been disappointed by an analysis that failed to treat these crimes as uniquely Japanese, the special burden of their history, guilt, and responsibility. And most would have been disappointed by a book that wasn't explicitly organized around anti-nationalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-militarist values. Those would not be small disappointments. Those messages are the very meaning of their lives now, for the ones that remain. But a writer must not care about what other people want. A writer says, my first responsibility is to my project. Hi, Carl, Talana, Leanne. So now he's interviewing somebody that did 731. He's just referring to them as X. Thanks, James. X was a member of Unit 731, the now notorious military unit that conducted research in biological and chemical warfare on human subjects at a secret military installation in Pingfan, an outlying district of Harbin in northeast China. Scientists in Section 1 of the unit worked with a range of diseases, included but not limited to cholera, typhoid, dysentery, anthrax, glanders, tetanus, gas, gangrene, scarlet fever, tick, encephalitis, epidemic hemorrhagic fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, pneumonia, salmonella, venereal diseases, and epidemic cerebrospinal meningitis. Working at full capacity, they were able to produce 300 kilograms of plague bacteria each month. Over 10,000 prisoners were used in such experiments. X explained that to cultivate the necessary bacteria at highest toxicity, they needed to use living bodies. It was important to begin dissecting people while they were still alive, which is vivisection. He also noted that he and his colleagues did not refer to the prisoners as human beings. They referred to them as logs. In Section 2, scientists and technicians tested bombs, maintained airplanes, and bred fleas. Over the years of Unit 731's operations, members experimented with various dispersal mechanisms in the field, dropping bombs, crop dusting with lethal pathogens, releasing infected rats into densely populated areas, lacing wells with germs, stashing infected sweet cakes in areas where they would look like supplies accidentally left behind by soldiers, and giving chocolates to POWs who were released so that they would return home and unwittingly distribute them among children. Sheldon Harris estimates that at least 250,000 civilians were killed in field tests. Good job, Charlotte. I'm happy. I hope it goes well. So we didn't talk about that when we did Unit 731. They also did field tests. It wasn't just people that they took as prisoners into the actual medical facility. They actually tested on unknowing civilians as well. So the number of deaths that can be attributed to the atrocities and medical experiments at Unit 731 can't really be calculated, because we really can't calculate an exact number of civilian deaths. So during the Zhejiang campaign, where more than 10,000 soldiers were killed, but they were accidentally Japanese soldiers, such weapons are difficult to control. Recent estimates put total deaths near 600,000. So we were thinking like 200,000 to 300,000 people in Unit 731. Thank you, Charlotte. It was really around 600,000. Casualties mounted well after the war ended. Plague epidemics continued to break out in the region over the years, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Many believe that this was caused by infected animals deliberately released into the population by members of Unit 731 when they evacuated in 1945. Some mice and rats today still test positive for Unit 731 pathogens. So still in 2021, there's still animals that are infected with diseases that Unit 731 did in the 40s. And as late as 1992, Chinese officials estimated that approximately 2 million pieces of chemical weapons remain buried in China, with approximately 100 tons of chemicals. Unit 731's human subject included captured Soviet prisoners, Chinese and Korean civilians accused of crimes ranging from vagrancy to spying, and the mentally handicapped. Many were simply kidnapped off the streets or from their homes. Some were abducted after innocently showing up at city offices for fake jobs advertised by Japanese authorities. I am going to have to mark this. Hold on one second. Yeah, just so when I redo Unit 731, I can get information from here. Because that's stuff that you really can't find on the internet. Prisoners were shackled and stripped of personal possessions, assigned numbers to replace their names, and then fed with the loving attention that Kobe cattle raisers lavished on their herds. They were strapped down and injected with pathogens, sprayed with droplets, and forced to ingest contaminated foods and liquids. Experiments involved hanging people upside down until they died, dehydrating people to death, injecting horse urine into their kidneys, freezing various body parts to investigate methods of healing frostbite, researching high-altitude flying by locking subjects into special pressure chambers and filming them while they died in convulsions, spreading syphilis through forced sex, and then vivisecting the patients to see the effects upon various internal organs at different stages, and infecting children with tuberculosis, a disease far too slow for utility as a biological weapon. Harris asserts, and therefore likely studied for purely academic purposes. The youngest test subject was a 3-day-old infant. Hi, Cherry and Joe, Susan. So the youngest victim, 3-day-old infant. All told, more than 20,000 personnel were involved in the biological warfare program. Why did they do it? Members of Unit 731, it appears, were normal men. They did it because they believed to the ends of advanced research justified the means. Their first responsibility was to the project. As General Ishii confessed in an inaugural speech, this work may cause some anguish as doctors, with a God-given mission to fight disease. Nevertheless, he continued, I beseech you to pursue this research in the thrilling spirit of a scientist to exert efforts to probing for the truth in natural science and research into and discovery of the unknown world. They also did it because it would advance their professional lives. Hundreds of the researchers later acquired leadership positions in Japanese universities and hospitals. 7 became directors and 5 vice presidents of Japan's post-war National Institute of Health. So some of these people that did these horrible things to these civilians that were kidnapped and 3-day-old babies were running the National Institute of Health after the war. 3 became founders of the Japanese pharmaceutical giant Midori Juchi, Green Cross, and finally they did it because the experimental subjects were prisoners. Unit 731 researchers reasoned that since the prisoners were going to be executed anyway, it would be better to acquire useful information rather than simply waste it. As did the U.S. military, which granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to members of Unit 731 and paid them in exchange for information they gathered in their experiments. Naturally, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Robert McQuail of Army Intelligence, the results of these experiments are of the highest intelligence value. The Soviets might have acquired the information, after all. That was a worry. Another worry was embarrassment. Edwin Hill, a chief U.S. scientist investigating Japanese biological weapons research, wrote of Unit 731 members, it is hoped that individuals who voluntarily contributed this information will be spared embarrassment. Another military officer who fervently supported the immunity deal nonetheless did emphasize the task of subsequent embarrassment for the U.S. government. But despite such worries over embarrassment, the data was considered too important and the deal too good to pass up. As Hill explained, such information could not be obtained in our laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation. These data were secured with a total outlay of 250,000 or 250,000 yen or 695 American dollars today, a mere pittance by comparison with the actual cost of the studies. Hi, Snapface. Yeah, I mean, they're making it sound like they were just doing it on war prisoners. They were doing it on civilians. While I was writing this book, I met with a delegation of Chinese researchers from Harbin. They worked in the very shadow of Unit 731's haunting urban ruins, but they needed to come here to the United States to fully understand what had happened there. We still have so many of the once secret documents. One of the researchers told me this story about their work. A woman had been trying for many years to find out what happened to her father during the war. He had been arrested and then he vanished. When she comes to the institute, they were able to determine through archives that he had been a prisoner of Unit 731. The woman knew what this meant, knew that her father had died as a human guinea pig. She was devastated. Was it worth it? Telling her? I asked. They believed so. Surviving families needed answers to be able to get on with their lives. How can people do these things? Some people believe this is the wrong question. We shouldn't be shocked that these things happen as often as they do. We should be shocked that they don't happen more. And we shouldn't be shocked that deep down we are really interested in knowing the ghastly details. Yes, we experience revulsion when witnessing pain, but we want that experience. The only reason revulsion happens inside us in such moments is because we've trained ourselves to react that way. It isn't instinctive or natural. Why wouldn't we be drawn to the representations of inescapable human pain? But it's more than that, insists Sigmund Freud. We are essentially violent creatures by nature. Our voyeuristic interest is actually aggressive. The truth, he writes, is that men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love, who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but that a powerful measure of desire for aggression has to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment. The result is their neighbors is to them not only possible helper or sexual object, but also a temptation to them to gratify their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without recompense, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause pain, to torture, and to kill him. Homo homini lupus, who has the courage to dispute it in the face of all evidence in his own life and history. This aggressive cruelty usually lies in wait for some provocation, or else it steps into the service of another purpose, the aim of which might as well have been the aim of which might as well have been achieved by milder measures, in circumstances that favor it, when those forces in the mind which ordinarily inhibit it cease to operate. It also manifests itself spontaneously and reveals men as a savage beast to whom they thought of sparing their own kind is alien. Hi, Shelby and Cherry. But despite our easily summoned ferocity, Barbara Enric counters, we are not really natural predators. We are, rather, natural prey who succeed too well. We are drawn to gladiatorial spectacle, for instance, not by bloodlust, but by the thrill of defensive solidarity, an evolutionary holdover that continues to give us fear-dissolving strength. Therefore, and Enric writes, we will not find the roots of the human attraction to war by searching the human psyche for some innate flaw that condemns us to harass and kill our fellows. In war, we act as if the only enemies we have are human ones. But I am proposing that the emotions we bring to war are derived, in an evolutionary sense, from a primal battle that the entire human species might easily have lost. We are not alone on this planet, and we were once decisively outnumbered by creatures far stronger and more vicious than ourselves. Because we are sociable creatures that form communities and bond intensely with each other, we are also vicious. Fierce xenophobia. Xenophobia, I guess like a way to explain that is like Japan's like a xenophobic country, like they don't like foreigners, so that's kind of like xenophobia. Where was I? Fierce xenophobia is a byproduct of our ardent in-group identification. We hate because we love. We are aggressive because we have things we care about protecting. Some believe in the civilizing process and the domestic and international laws of the modern world of nation states set limits to and curb our atavistic aggression. It is in anomic conditions, quintessentially, and the civilization on making space of the battlefield, that we revert to our more animal selves. But others believe that, on the contrary, the civilizing process has succeeded, as Zygmunt Bauman writes, in substituting artificial and flexible patterns of human conduct for natural drives, and hence made possible a scale of inhumanity and destruction which have remained inconceivable as long as natural predispositions guided human action. The small practice we have in our deep past to limit intraspecific violence, for instance, exogamy, the practice of marrying outside a social unit to promote intergroup harmony, don't stand a chance in a world of massive nation states characterized by strong historical narratives and ideological commitments. And when these states experience significant economic problems or dramatic social changes, particularly when combined with a collective memory of injury at the hands of others, feelings of collective disorganization and helplessness can lead to scapegoating at the levels of a whole people. Good night, Jody. Love you. Genocide is not a modern invention. The Athenian slaughter of all men captured in the invasion of Melos and Rome's sack of Carthage, for instance, have been both described as genocide. But widespread acceptance of the word itself, which was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, and the intensive study of the phenomenon are both post-Holocaust. So the word genocide didn't even exist until after the Holocaust. After those horrors, scholars searched feverishly and exhaustively for predisposing characteristics to genocide in the hopes that understanding causes could give us clues about prevention. Initially, teams of researchers looked for commonalities in the personality of perpetrators. It would be comforting to believe that there is something broken, or at least different, in evil people, that we could spot them, if even only with hindsight. Is there an authoritarian personality, a type predisposed to prejudice and hate? Are they insane? Do they have split or doubled identities? Are they sensation seekers? Do they tend to rely upon others to cope with problems? Do they have difficulty healing with stress? Do they suffer from depression? Do they have tendencies towards self-condemnation or all or none thinking? Do they have low self-esteem, high self-esteem? Do they have domineering fathers and punitive mothers? Were their basic needs frustrated in early life? Are they submissive to authority? Are they unimaginative or rigid in their thinking, superstitious, preoccupied with toughness and sex? James Waller lucidly summarizes a range of such studies conducted over the decades and concludes bluntly, the features purportedly common to evil people are also common to millions of other individuals who may have done nothing more criminal in their lives than commit a mere parking violation. The evil are, in Christopher Browning's phrase, ordinary men. So tons of studies show that the people that commit some of the worst war atrocities have no different issues than you and I do. Today, most scholars trace genocidal behavior to organizational identity, social context, and national ideologies rather to individual personalities, which in Japan, they used Shinto and turned it into took Shinto, which is like a spiritual ideology in Japan, and like kind of transformed it into like a state-run religion to kind of get people into that mindset. There's actually a whole interesting study on that. In other words, you're not so much who you are as where you are. Ben Kieran makes a persuasive argument for those commonalities to genocide: racism, religious prejudices, revivalist cults of antiquity, territorial expansionism, an obsession with contesting and cultivating land, and the idolization of social classes such as the peasantry. Staub emphasizes nationalism, difficult life conditions, cultural self-concepts that combine a sense of entitlement with underlying security, monolithic rather than pluralistic value system, a history of devaluing the groups that would become victims, and authoritarian or hierarchical social structures, which basically sums up Japan. Waller blames ethnocentrism, xenophobia, and the desire for social dominance as part of an evolutionary programmed human nature, and also rational self-interest, moral disengagement, and the orientation towards authority as predictable patterns in organizational behavior. And Browning lists wartime brutalization, racism, segmentation, and routinization of the task, special selection of the perpetrators, careerism, obedience and orders, defiance to authority, and ideological indoctrination and conformity. Many emphasize that the capacity for genocidal violence involves cultural training that starts young. Pre-war public education in Japan, for instance, involved systematic inculcation of militarism and emperor worship. The emperor was seen as a god. So including arithmetic lessons based on battlefield situations and science classes that include general information about searchlights, wireless communication, landmines, and torpedoes. Sorry, my phone was going on. Please tell me that was... Thank you, Susan. No, that's great. Thank you for the dono. On my next video, I'm going to put everybody that's donated on like a screen, kind of like Disturbing does. So don't worry. I went through all of my receipts since February, since I started the channel, and wrote down names. Many emphasize that the capacity for genocidal violence involves... Oh, we already read that. An emblematic story from a Japanese primary school textbook goes like this. During the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, an officer sees a sailor weeping over a letter from home. The officer chastises the sailor for his shameful display of weakness, assuming that the letter is from a lover begging for a safe return and that the young man is crying over their separation. But the young man reveals instead that the letter is from his mother, and that she has written to say she is ashamed of him for not distinguishing himself in battle or gloriously dying for the emperor. The officer is surprised and pleased. So moms were not pleased unless their sons died in the name of the emperor. Amiko Onuki tyranny finds this blatant die for the emperor ideology throughout pre-war Japanese society. In kindergarten, counting songs, an elementary school song about locomotives, a prize offered in a box of candy, a military songbook. Onuki tyranny also notes how the evocative symbolism of cherry blossoms in Japanese culture was manipulated across a range of social fields to naturalize the emperor system and aestheticize militarism. So they're teaching kids so young. To the list of things that prepare us for violence, then, we might also add beauty. Nationalist wars, after all, were always magnificent. Songs, parades, uniforms, flags, lovely metaphors glorifying death. Kaneko-san described to me a number of formative books he was required to read as part of his compulsory education. One book had a moment in it that was particularly memorable for Kaneko-san as a young boy. As the young hero takes leave of his mother to go to war, she tells him, "When you go to the front, for His Majesty the Emperor, fight hard for our country, boy." When it came time for Kaneko to be deployed, he remembered that moment and said to his mother, "Mama, when I go to the front, I'm definitely going to do something honorable. I intend to be praised by my mom," he said, "to make her happy." So I said that. And then my mom, very still, silently listened. And then she stared hard at my face and said, "You idiot. Your mama doesn't need any goddamn," and then it's like unclear what she said, "just survive and come home." And at that time, I thought, wow, what's wrong with my mom? At the front, Kaneko-san dreamed about being honored. This was what you might call arrogance. You'd go back to your town and they'd say, that guy Kaneko, he went to the front and killed so many people. That's a big deal. They'd say that sort of thing. This guy called Kaneko is amazing, amazing. The village people would all say that sort of thing, wouldn't they? It would become something to be proud of. It was different when people died, Kaneko-san said. When we soldiers died, we were taught to always say, "Long live His Majesty the Emperor." But not a single person said, "Long live His Majesty the Emperor." Yeah, everyone yelled, "Ma, ma," right? Everyone said that, and that was the end. Unfortunately, when our illusions are shattered on the battlefield, we are not rendered less dangerous, less vicious. Easy heroism, personal immorality, the moral righteousness of one's leaders, the glory of sacrifice. When the illusion that inspired us to pick up our weapons fail, we can become, paradoxically, more likely to use those weapons with reckless frenzy. Okay. Now he's going to interview a guy named Ibato-san. So it says like there, Ibato-san, here we go. You know, public education, they drove loyalty and patriotism, the sort of ideology home. In other words, what does that mean? It means that the country of Japan is, well, the country of God. It is the absolute best country in the world. That idea was thoroughly planted into us. If you turn it over, it means to despise other races. This is the sort of ideology it is. And from the time we were small, we called Chinese people, and I don't want to say this word, but it's in the book, dirty chinks, made fun of them. We called Russians Ruski pigs. We called Westerners hairy barbarians, you know? And so this meant that when the people of Japan joined the army and went to the front, no matter how many Chinese they killed, they didn't think of it being much different from killing a dog or a cat. So when you dehumanize a person and take away their human characteristics, it's much easier to get rid of them. Another reason is, like I said before, to give your life to the leader, His Majesty the Emperor, and what is absolutely the greatest country in the world, Japan, is a sacred duty and the highest honor. There's that ideology, you know, and this ideology, when you go into the military, is strengthened more and more, and your personality is taken away. When it's time to go to battle, at those times when you were ordered to be superior, you couldn't resist. So the humanitarian ideology I learned about in college, you couldn't win out over the ideology of loyalty and patriotism. That had been drilled into me from the time I was small. In my mind, there's nothing as important as primary and middle school public education. So what else must political movements do to make its monsters they need? For the sake of argument, let's take as a starting point the idea about this question makes sense. Let's assume that we are not inherently evil creatures, that it takes work to make us do such things. This is not obvious, and in fact runs counter to a common assumption about the wartime behavior, that brutality is released when socializing constraints are absent, that once men are released in a battle, the primal impulses to cruelty will emerge. In fact, it doesn't take a battle at all. And it takes a little bit of permission, and all it takes is the doctor's gown, as we've seen in the Milgram experiment, or a prison guard uniform, as we will see in the Stanford prison experiment, to make us hurt each other so gratuitously. Hi, Lou. But we do not have to accept this grim view of what it is to be human. Cicero Maxim, in In time of war, the law is silent, is often taken as truism both about what happens in war, we abandon moral rules, and about what we believe about war's interior structure, namely, that it is a rule-free event, that it tends towards maximum violence because that is its nature. But the International Committee of the Red Cross's People on War report, unprecedented survey of civilians and combatants all across the globe, reveals a robust international consensus to the contrary. Only 4% of respondents and interviewees believe that in war, everything is allowed. 59% believe wars have rules and the violators should be punished afterwards. 64% insisted combatants are morally obligated to leave civilians alone. Such beliefs do not dissolve under gunfire. In fact, after World War II, Army Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall released a now controversial study claiming that, on average, only 15 to 20 men out of 100 use their weapons at all during combat action. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, a professor and former Army Ranger, goes on to argue that this ratio seems relatively stable across times and cultures. The human resistance to killing other humans is so strong, he writes. In many circumstances, soldiers on the battlefield will die before they can overcome it. William Faulkner's allegorical novel, A Fable, in which Jesus Christ returns as a soldier in World War I to organize pacifist resistance, commemorated a real anxiety among the war's military leaders, namely that despite the brutalizing effect of uncountable, mutually inflicted casualties, alarming outbursts of nonviolence continue to recur along the front. Violent regimes over the centuries have always understood this truth. We are not wolves needing only to be unleashed. Tyrants and war makers need to be deliberate, thoughtful, thorough, and unresting. They need to do a great number of things over a long period of time to create and sustain their killers, to overcome, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the animal pity by which all normal men are affected in the presence of physical suffering. Yeah, William Faulkner's allegoric novel, A Fable. Yeah. So what do political movements need to do to make the monsters they need? First, everybody agrees you must put them in a group. From French psychologist Gustave Le Bon to American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, thinkers have theorized the dangers of crowd and group behavior, which is important. In Moral Man and in Moral Society, Niebuhr sharply condemns that moral obtuseness of human collectives. He argued that the frustrations of the average man, who can never realize the power and the glory which his imagination sets as the ideal, make him a willing implement of the group, inevitably driven by lusts and ambitions that can provide finally a taste of power. Group identity is not only a protective shell for those made insecure by social disruption, it is a kind of abandoned group behavior. It's kind of an abandoned group behavior. Niebuhr and others have argued hews to the moral lowest common denominator. The I can never say this word. The anonymity of group action is one of its primary moral hazards. In a seminal study on anonymity and aggression, Philip Zimbardo had female college students administer what they believed to be a painful electric shocks to other women. These students, concealed by hoods and loose coats, delivered twice as much shock as those who remained physically recognizable. Zimbardo concluded from his experiments that we are more likely to engage in reckless behavior when we enter a state of de-individuation. So people are more likely to do horrible things when they're in large groups, such as like an army setting. That is a state in which a person loses sense of herself as a separate individual, in which self-focused attention or self-consciousness is reduced. Further studies have revealed that almost anything that makes us feel de-individuated, including crowds, cover of night, face paint, masks, and sunglasses, increase the possibility of antisocial behavior. Like, I always felt that if I wore sunglasses, like I felt more powerful, like I could do anything, because people really couldn't groupthink. People really couldn't look into my eyes and like see like how scared I was or how anxious I was. Like I felt like I could do anything I wanted and even get away with things. Group membership can promote not only de-individuation, in which the moral self is physically submerged, but also what might be called intra-individuation, in which the moral self is physically subdivided. In intra-individuation, your identity does not expand, diffuse, and dissolve into the generalized aspect of the crowd. Instead, it shrinks, rigidifies, and compartmentalizes into self-contained units, into narrowing, non-communicating, and even incompatible functions. If in de-individuation, the self is no longer a particular, in intra-individuation, the other is no longer a particular. In other words, when with de-individuation, your relationship to yourself is mediated through your collectivized identity. With intra-individuation, your relationship to others is mediated through your specialized social role. The other becomes an abstraction, where de-individuation promotes impulsive cruelty, intra-individuation promotes calculated cruelty, or rather, it promotes behavior that is sufficiently rationalized so as not to feel like cruelty. Boop, boop. Sorry. Consider Eichmann, the bureaucrat of the Holocaust. Better yet, argue Arthur Applebaum. Consider Charles Henry Sanson, the executioner of Paris during the Terror. Some saw him as a ghoulish monster, others as a tragic figure caught between duty and sentiment. But the executioner saw himself, and Applebaum wryly suggests, as we might too, just as another professional, no different from a lawyer or a doctor. If the collective determines it is necessary to have executioner, then there will be executioners. And if you are that executioner, you really ought to be a good one. Being good at your job is, after all, part of what it means to be a good human, part of your responsibility to others. Do your share, and also your responsibility to yourself. Transcend mediocrity. Your job may require actions that are not typically a component of human goodness, but you would not describe what a surgeon does as stabbing, what a lawyer does as robbing, or what a prosecutor does as kidnapping, would you? And imagined, Sanson asks in Applebaum's philosophical dialogue. Yes, good executioners murder, good doctors ignore pain, and good lawyers lie. But when we do these things as occupiers of roles rather than as individuals, we are not murdering, ignoring pain, or lying. We are executing, triaging, and offering alternative theories. So even though the lawyers regularly and intentionally induced false belief, they aren't deceiving. They are only, in scare quotes, deceiving. That's an interesting way to think. Bye, Renee. Socially authorized specialization allows lawyers in their special capacity and us in our various special capacities, citizens, fathers, soldiers, etc., to substitute the circumscribed morality of a role for our full human morality. The pilot of the Enola Gay denied moral discomfort over bombing Hiroshima, but we all deny in one way or another as easily as we slip in the water. So who are we to criticize the executioners we rely upon? Our discomfort with them isn't driven by authentic moral force. It is driven by personal squeamishness. I act for the people in every sense of the word, in their name, for their benefit, upon their direction, declared Applebaum's executioner. Every time I cut a head off of every citizen, or at least every citizen who approves of the death penalty, does so as well. If they are blameless, so am I. If I am blameworthy, so are they. The existence of rules demanding antisocial behavior, of course, is not enough. Such rules are usually self-limiting. Law provides minimal authorization, and personality provides maximal resistance. Both say, go only this far. To make war criminals, demons, and devils, as the men I talk to describe themselves, you need the opposite combination: maximal authorization and minimal personality. You must erode the identity of those you need to do the killing, whether soldiers or torturers, by systematically humiliating them and stripping them of their normal domestic identity. Collectivize their sense of self by shaving their heads. Make them wear identical uniforms, controlling their language through in-group slang and chants, and forcing them to eat, sleep, and march as one. Control access to information. Isolate them from their family and friends in the regular world. Subject them to systematic physical stress and sleep deprivation, and to rule systems that combines harsh and arbitrary penalties with occasional rewards. Not nearly every former soldier I talked to emphasized the tremendous effects of peer pressure, describing incidents of bullying and shaming, especially being slapped or hit. And everybody emphasized the importance of the regime's willingness to take responsibility for their actions. To make people like this, regimes must exploit the normal human impulse to obedience and conformity, the very same impulses that can generate group altruism and morality, but instead orient them towards violence. As one British soldier describes the procedure, take a young man, desperate to establish an identity in the adult world, make him believe military prowess is a epitome of masculinity. Teach him to accept absolutely the authority of those in command. Give him an exaggerated sense of self-worth by making him part of the elite. Teach him to value aggression and to dehumanize those who are not part of his group, and give him permission to use any level of violence without the moral restraints which govern him elsewhere. It is like a cult, Celia. But making monsters isn't only a matter of conditioning, it's also a matter of narrative. Commonly among unrepentant war criminals, you will see a grandiose self-pity that helps them preserve a sense of self. I bore the burden of having to do these things. Robert J. Lifton saw this narrative template in the Nazi doctors at Auschwitz, who perceived their terrible but necessary work of killing as an ordeal of self-sacrifice for the immortal Germanic people. Such self-absolution in Germany and elsewhere is made possible by stories of historical mission and utopian possibility provided by charismatic leaders. It is a psychological entry into an abstract, even mythic times that blurs the individuality of conduct. So perhaps the best way to think about violence and social roles is this. The problem isn't what we reduce people to specific roles that permit violence. The problem is that the roles aren't specific enough. In war, everything is weird. The landscape is foreign, seemingly unreal. We are separated from all reference groups we have grown to rely upon for moral judgment. Nothing is familiar. There are no reality checks. War confuses us. In that confusion, we begin to create new moral realities. I think that's a really strong, important thing. Veteran Tim O'Brien. Oh, Tim O'Brien. I think he wrote the book, The Things We Carry. I think it was about the Vietnam War. For the common soldier, at least, war has the feel, the spiritual texture of great ghostly fog, thick and permanent. There is no clarity. Everything swirls. The old rules are no longer binding. The old truths are no longer true. Right spills over into the wrong. Order blends into chaos. Love into hate. Ugliness into beauty. Law into anarchy. Civility into savagery. The vapor sucks you in. You can't tell where you are and why you're there, and the only certainty is overwhelming ambiguity. And what we know is that OS conformity experiments, subjects are shown simple lines and asked to match their lengths. Volunteers in the experiment have no trouble identifying correct line length. But when volunteers are surrounded by actors posing as volunteers, and these actors then select the incorrect links, volunteers begin to conform and also misidentify the clearly identifiable lines. They typically resist in the beginning, displaying confusion and discomfort, but with repeated trials, they begin to acquiesce to the group judgment, often when visibly defeated apathy. In these experiments, psychologists distinguish informational conformity. Volunteers begin to distrust their own judgment from normative conformity. Volunteers know the group is wrong, but do not wish to appear deviant by disagreeing. Either way, the important thing these experiments show is how easy it is to get people to repudiate the basics of their world. The sad truth is the great revelation of the 20th century totalitarianism. Drawing upon the work of art, one scholar writes, we may desperately want to believe that there is something about human beings that cannot be transformed, something deep about the human self, the voice of conscience, or the sense of responsibility that cannot be obliterated. But after totalitarianism, we can no longer hold on to those beliefs. This is the specter that now haunts us. Perhaps more frightening, however, is that totalitarianism is not required. Take a group of poorly trained young people, put them in a strange and frightening environment, and give them unclear roles with light or no regulation. Each small hurtful act they commit in the course of making their confused way will make the next act seem more normal. Give them time, and they will eventually shed their moral identities, but not because they are inhumane. They will do that because they are human. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo recruited college students for a mock prison experiment at Stanford University. Subjects were randomly assigned a position of prisoner or guard and were then asked to role play their position. Is everyone familiar with the Zimbardo experiment? I might be able to find a short thing on the Zimbardo experiment. One second. Zimbardo experiment. Oh, I want one that's not so long. Here, let me see this one. One second.
1971.
I want to find. I can play some of this. I'll go through a little bit. Let me see. Share. Because I can't play the whole thing. Let me know if you guys can hear the sound. When I play it. Hold on. Let me get this up on my phone and then let me know if you guys can hear the sound when I play it. This Zimbardo experiment was interesting. I'll kind of like have it explain it a little bit and then I'll like kind of like breeze through it. Try to get my phone up so I can see. I'll just listen to it myself.
I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit.
Hey, I don't want anybody left. Violation of the rules, I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know?
I've never screamed so loud in my life. Never been so upset in my life. It was an experience of being out of control.
I just fucking can't take it.
Stanford University, Northern California, one of America's most prestigious academic institutions, and in 1971, the scene of one of the most notorious experiments in the history of psychology.
I was interested in what happens if you put good people in an evil place. Does the situation outside of you, the institution, come to control your behavior, or does the things inside of you, your attitude, your values, your morality, allow you to rise above a negative environment?
The negative environment Zimbardo chose to test his ideas was a prison. He would convert the basement of the university's psychology department into a subterranean jail.
We put prison doors on each of 3 office cells. In the cells, there was nothing but 3 beds, and there was actually very little room for anything else because they were very small. And here we had solitary confinement, which we call the hole. And in the hole was the place where prisoners would be put for punishment. It was a very, very small area. When you closed the door, it was totally dark. All the guards wore military uniforms, and we had them wear these silver reflecting sunglasses. And what it does is you can't see someone's eyes, and so that loses some of the humanness, the humanity. In general, we wanted to create a sense of power. That is, the guards as a category are people who have power over others, in this case, power over the prisoners.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority.
So I'm going to kind of like go a little bit further in the documentary so you can like see how these people start acting. They like took regular students and people that volunteered and just randomly assigned their roles. And these are just normal people. And eventually they had to stop the experiment because people started to get like really mean and not like super violent, but like the inmates started fighting against each other, like forming little groups to try to like overthrow the guards and stuff. It was crazy. Like they had to stop it because some people were getting psychologically hurt. They thought it was real.
Divide and conquer.
Isolated and distraught, prisoner 819 told Zimbardo he wanted to leave.
While I'm interviewing 819 and saying, okay, it's all over. Thank you for your participation. I'll give you money for the whole 2 weeks, even though you're leaving early. He hears the prisoners shouting, 819 did a bad thing.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
And he said, I can't leave. And he's crying. And he says, I can't leave. So what do you mean you can't leave? He said, no, I have to go back because I don't want them to think that I'm a bad prisoner. And that's when I really flipped out. That in such a short time, a college student's thinking could become so distorted. I said, you're not a bad prisoner. You're not a prisoner. And this is not a prison. And it was this thing where he opened his eyes. And it was just really like a cloud being lifted.
Seeing things clearly, prisoner 819 reverted to his original request and was released. To replace him, the experimenters called in one of their reserves from the standby list.
I got a phone call saying, are you still available as an alternate? Kind of cheery female secretary voice. I said, yes, sure. And so she said, could you start this afternoon? And I said, yes, sure. And my role in the experiment really began. I was blindfolded and then stripped and supposedly deloused.
He came into a madhouse, full blown. All of us had gradually acclimated to the increasing level of aggression, the increasing powerlessness of the prisoners, the increasing dominance of the guards. And he comes in and says, what's happening here to the other prisoners? And they said, yeah, you better not make trouble. It's really terrible. It's a real prison. And he says, I'm out of here. I don't want. And they said, no, you can't leave. Once you're here, you're stuck. This is a real prison.
Well, 1-6, since you got your hands in the air, why don't you play Frankenstein? 293, you can be the bride of Frankenstein. You stand here.
Prisoner 416 was soon subjected to the harassment of Dave Eshelman, nicknamed John Wayne because of his macho attitude.
1-6, and I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 293.
I made the decision that I would be as intimidating, as cold, as cruel as possible.
I love you, 293. Get up close. Get up close. I love you, 293. I love you, 293. You smile, 293. You get down here and do 10 push-ups. 2, 3.
I just watched a movie called Cool Hand Luke, and the mean, intimidating.
Yeah, so there's tons of documentaries on YouTube about that. That's really interesting. Anyways, Zimbardo planned for students to live together in a simulated prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology building for several weeks so that he and his students' research associates could use group dynamics. Zimbardo quickly lost control of the experiment, however, and had to cancel it after a handful of days. The experiment began on Sunday. Zimbardo convinced the local police to stage surprise arrests of the would-be prisoners. Some public witnesses, including at least one family member, believed their arrests were real. Once everybody was gathered in the basement, behaviors degenerated quickly. Here is Zimbardo's account of Tuesday. Our prisoners are looking raggedy and bleary-eyed, and our little prison is beginning to smell like a men's toilet in a New York subway station. Seems that some guards have made toilet visits a privilege to be awarded infrequently and never after lights out. During the night, prisoners have to urinate and defecate in buckets in their cells, and some guards refuse to allow them to be emptied until morning. By that point, even Zimbardo found himself succumbing to the pressures of the simulated role-playing, thinking and acting strangely. He was behaving less and less like a psychologist and more like a prison warden, obsessing over the possibility of a rumored assault upon his prison and working to hide signs of distress from visiting parents. On Wednesday, Zimbardo arranged for a priest to visit with the prisoners. He describes the meeting. Prisoner Stu 819 is looking terrible, to say the least. Dark circles underneath his eyes, uncombed hair going in every direction but down. This morning, Stu 819 did a bad thing. In a rage, he messed up his cell, tearing up the pillow and throwing the feathers everywhere. He was put in the hole, and his cellmates had to clean up the mess. He has been depressed following his parents' visit last night. Priest, I wonder if you discussed the idea that your family might get a lawyer for you? 819, they knew I was a prisoner. I told them what I was doing here, about the numbers, the regulations, the hassles. Priest, how do you feel now? 819, I have a bad headache. I need a doctor. I intervene, trying to discover the basis of his headache. I ask him whether it was a typical migraine or maybe even being caused by exhaustion, hunger, heat, stress, constipation, or vision problems. 819, I just feel kind of drained, nervous. Then he breaks down and starts to cry. Tears, big heaving sighs. The priest calmly gives him a handkerchief to wipe his tears away. Now there, it can't all be that bad. How long have you been in this place? Only 3 days? You're going to have to be less emotional. By Thursday, guards were sexually humiliating prisoners. So the third day, they were sexually humiliating people already. Okay, now pay attention. You 3 are going to be female camels. Get over here and bend over, touching your hands to the floor. When they do, their naked butts are exposed since they are wearing no underwear beneath their smock dresses. Hellman continues with obvious glee. Now you 2, you're male camels. Stand behind the females and hump them. Burden giggles at the double entendre. Although their bodies never touch, the helpless prisoners are simulating sodomy by making thrusting motions or humping. The next day, Friday, Zimbardo closed the experiment. Afterwards, students were asked to reflect on their remarkable experiences. Recalling a violent scuffle he had with a prisoner, one guard explained it this way. I realized that when I was as much a prisoner as they were, I was just a reaction to their feelings. They had more of a choice in their actions. I don't think we did. We were both crushed by the situation of oppressiveness, but we guards had the illusion of freedom. I realized later that we were all slaves to something in the environment. Now we're getting back to Ibado-san's story. And this is where he starts talking about his story. Right. Yes, the recruitment training in the Japanese army was extremely, well, in one word, you could say it was barbaric. So what did they do? Well, the other soldiers, the new recruits, would be put inside this one room with old soldiers. And then the old soldiers would call it education. But what they called the education of the recruits was, in fact, boredom. You see, the old soldiers who were already sick of the army would deal out corporal punishment of the recruits day and night. Do you understand what corporal punishment? You know, they'd hit our cheeks, slaps, I said. Right here, yeah, at all hours of the day, again and again. And so if you're wondering what kind of thing brought that on, if you were called on and your response was bad, say, or if you acted big, like if you were swaggering around, or if you didn't maintain your shoes, or you didn't maintain your weapons, due to those things, day or night, the slaps would come. As a result, if you're wondering, that day or night, we'd be slapped. The result of that was, in short, that the feeling and reason that we humans have been completely destroyed by this corporal punishment, that when you heard a superior or an old soldier say something, you would respond instinctively, like, well, a robot, I suppose. And so the character that each individual human being has, they killed it, destroyed it, you could say, I suppose, but they'll make it so you respond reflexively to the orders of those above you, like a robot or slave. Kaneko-san, like others, spoke of being trained to revere authority. Many people have made the argument that Japan at the time was uniquely extreme in this way, but the fact is, all regimes train their subjects in obedience, if in different ways and to different degrees. And war and genocide are possible because we want to be obedient. We desire to surrender our responsibility for our choices to another, to escape what existentialist Simon de Beauvoir calls the anguish of freedom. We let ourselves believe a leader can create a meaning for us, and we delight in surrendering the terrible weight of our individual agency. John Glenn Gray, a U.S. veteran of World War II, writes of the satisfaction soldiers experience in sloughing off responsibility. Becoming a soldier was like escaping from one's own shadow. Frequently, he claims, he heard people remark of the army oath. When I raised my right hand, I took the oath. I freed myself of the consequences for what I do. I'll do what they tell me and nobody can blame me. The mass violence of humans is complex and perplexing, but in most cases, it can be traced back to the simple moment when a man, often but not always a man, permitted himself to surrender his agency to another. There is an attractive simplicity in obedience, an intelligibility to be found in the doctrine of superior orders. But we seek a still more comprehensive simplicity than that, not just simplicity of choices and confusing moments, but also simplicity in our worldview. We have a need to retreat from the complexity and indeterminacy, I can't say that word, that defines existence, into comforting clarity. As a prominent Nazi once said, I was full of gratitude to the SS for the intellectual guidance it gave me. We were all thankful. Many of us had been so bewildered before joining the organization. We did not understand what was happening around us. Everything was so mixed up. The SS offered us a series of simple ideas that we could understand, and we believed them. Fanaticism clarifies meaning, gives strength and structure to identity, enables confident action in a bewildering world. It provides a frame of meaning for suffering and thereby ameliorates it. It promises purpose where we most need it, turning even the most difficult experiences into opportunity to embody our deepest values, turning trauma into tragedy. Indeed, fanaticism is a necessary aspect of human identity and a prerequisite for social order. Although when people are fanatical about things that fit in with social norms or our own values, we don't call it fanaticism, we call it a belief. I find myself flinching when the Chukrin's anti-nationalist pacifism is characterized as fanaticism, for instance, but not their youthful devotion to the emperor, even though both seem to me the products of some emotional structure, namely a dogged capacity for commitment once capable of transcending the belief-shattering horrors of the battlefield and now capable of transcending the scorns of their homeland. In a world of complex problems and inevitably imperfect fixes, fanaticism promotes simple and total solutions. So does violence. Part of simplifying clarification of the Chukrin's mid-century world involved identifying and demoting outgroups, specifically preparing to injure Korean and Chinese people. As in other cases of genocide, what you need to do is make victims seem an appropriate target, emphasize throughout comprehensive propaganda program, through media and education, that those you want to target are different, that they do not belong, emphasize their alienness, their exclusion from the real human community that would otherwise deserve and indeed naturally command our respect. This work is crucial to overcome the strong, possibly innate human inhibition against interest-specific violence. We must form what Erik Erikson calls pseudosciences, in groups established through the ritual that embody the humanity. The human identity. Killing is facilitated by the collective reconceptualization of the enemy group are less than human, and the consequent determination that any individual member of the group is inimical identities is a suitable target for lethal violence. Purity is an especially useful concept here. If culture can successfully cultivate all or nothing polar thinking, it can divide the world into pure and impure. The impure deserves injury, not only because their impurity is inherently disgusting, but also because it threatens to contaminate the community of the pure. In what is truly a vicious cycle, the pure merit violence too, because they can never embody the total demands of polar purity, which means that their secret guilt and self-disgust is then projected onto the impure as amplified contempt. This is the stuff, writes Lifton, of mass hatreds, purges of heretics, and political and religious holy wars. The deadly racism in the Second Sino-Japanese War, like the racism deployed in other violent and nonviolent conflicts, was a product of shifting historical tensions and manipulative cultural re-narration. Michael Weiner tracks racial tensions between Japan and China back to the end of the Tokugawa period, when scholars of the Kokugaku School of National Learning upended the centuries-old tradition of relying upon Chinese Confucianism as the primary source of civilization and morality. In rejecting Sino-centrism, scholars sought to establish the innate superiority of Japanese culture over that of China and all other nations, and in this respect foreshadowed the imperial rhetoric of the 19th century. According to the new cultural narrative, the ancient purity of the divine land had in fact corrupted by external agents in form of Confucianism and Buddhism. Slavish adherence to the alien culture had only served to obscure the true Wakon, Japanese spirit or soul, and thus deprive Japan of its rightful position in the world order. Whew, I think that I'm going to call that a day now. We read from page 39 all the way to page 64. That was a lot of reading. But the book only has 224 pages. So we have that much left because we're here. So if I can read 40 pages a day, we could finish it this week. God, my mouth is so dry. Mix Adderall, my Adderall, trying to talk and then not taking a drink of water. So that's interesting. See, I like this book because I couldn't read a book where it was just the interviews of all of the horrible things that they were doing. That would be way too much. But it makes it, don't want to feel like I'm just reading about horrible things and thinking about the people that died. I want to know why these people did these things. And I think like the little bit of like talking about like the Stanford prison experiment, the Milgram experiment, all that stuff, discussing like psychology, sociology. I think it also helps us understanding not only why they did evil things, but like why we want to know about it and how we can do it in a respectable manner that's just not sensationalizing tragedy, if you understand what I'm saying. That was a lot. That was an hour. I like how I could say the big words, but then the little words I can't say. I don't even know where my phone went. Boop, boop, boop. Yes, thank you. I don't know if Susan is still here, but thank you for your donation. Any little bit helps. Thank you. I'm such a nerd. I think that anybody could be broken down to do anything that these soldiers did. Just exactly what they showed in the Stanford experiment. And just like even with the line experiment, you had people that were correctly calling out the lengths of a line. But when you had the mass majority of people come in, the actors, pretending they were volunteers and they were correctly choosing the line length, people were hesitant at first, but they all joined. Why do you, even the most religious person can do it? Why do you think people join religion? Because they want to be seen as good, part of the group, that they're part of something. So if all the people that are religious mindset switch over to the other side, where do you think all the people are going to follow? No, thank you, Susan. Appreciate the donations. Got to keep the internet on. Got to keep the internet on. I bought a planner. I was like, I justified my shopping. I will buy this $30 Hello Kitty planner with my name on it with all the accessories because I'm going to keep, like a detailed schedule of when my bills are due. So when I had all the money left over this month, I'm going to take the kids to the water park. I'm going to do this and that, pay some extra bills. And then I'm like looking at the end of the month. I'm like, oh, crap. That was the internet money. So that's how it is. Also, I'm going to be on a show. I should be doing a podcast with Ron tonight. He mentioned it, but I know how his schedule is somewhat fluid. Like it can change at a moment's notice. So Ron's channel, since Surviving Life is on a hiatus. Oh, man. It's going to be right on during Mark Ribier's. So I might be on a show with Ron tonight. That's Ron's channel if you're not familiar. It does, Celia. Well, I'm so glad everyone enjoyed. Yeah, you better be on a show tonight because I did my makeup this morning. I wasn't going to do it. And I had to listen to that stupid soundboard for like an hour. Do you know how annoying it is when somebody plays a soundboard after like every action? It's annoying. But I'm going to go. It is 10:39. We have a thunderstorm coming here, supposedly. So thank you so much. I love everyone. And we'll probably read again tomorrow. But tomorrow I was going to do games too, I think. Thank you, Celia. So, yes. We're going to play Jackbox games tomorrow. Could have done it last night, seeing how my date ditched me. But whatever. I was supposed to have a date yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and all of them got canceled. That's my luck. So I love you guys. See you tomorrow. Bye.